this blind and deaf old man wasn't just any elderly father. He was a black billionaire who pretended to be blind and deaf, but he saw his family's ultimate betrayal. Locked in a small room at the back of his own mansion, he quietly watched as his white wife and 2 white sons plotted to sell his properties and send him to a government welfare home. They laughed, thinking he couldn't see or hear anything, while the only person who truly cared, his black adopted daughter, tried desperately to stop them. The dimly lit room where they kept him smelled of neglect, the curtains always drawn, the air stale and heavy. His dark glasses reflected the faint light that crept under the door, and the hearing aid in his ear remained strategically silent. But behind those glasses, his eyes saw everything. Behind that silence, he heard every venomous word. If you've ever been ignored or betrayed by your own family, pause and ask yourself, would you have the courage to stand for what's right? If you want to witness how this story unfolds and see true justice prevail, subscribe now. You don't want to miss what happens next when everything comes crashing down. Malcolm Thornton had built an empire from nothing. Born in the segregated South, raised by a single mother who cleaned houses for pennies, he had clawed his way through every barrier society placed before him. He graduated top of his class, invented a revolutionary software platform in the early days of the internet, and turned it into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. He owned properties across 3 continents, employed thousands, and had his name etched into the philanthropic history of a dozen cities. But none of that mattered now. Now, he was just an old man in a small room, supposedly blind and deaf, forgotten by the family he had loved and provided for. His wife, Catherine, had been a different woman when they met 30 years ago. Or perhaps she had simply been better at hiding who she truly was. Back then, she had smiled at his jokes, admired his ambition, and seemed to genuinely care about the causes he championed. They married in a ceremony that made headlines, a union that some celebrated and others criticized. Malcolm never paid attention to the critics. He believed in love, in partnership, in building something together. They had tried for children, and when that proved difficult, they adopted 2 boys, Ryan and Derek, both white, both young enough to be molded into decent human beings. Or so Malcolm had hoped. Then came Amara. She was 8 years old when Malcolm found her at one of his charity events, a bright-eyed girl with a smile that could light up a room despite the hardships she had endured in foster care. Something in her reminded him of himself, of the hunger to prove the world wrong, to rise above circumstances. He and Catherine adopted her, and for a while it seemed like their family was complete. But as the boys grew older, as Catherine grew more comfortable in her wealth, the cracks began to show. The boys became entitled, arrogant, dismissive of the values Malcolm tried to instill. Catherine became cold, calculating, more interested in country club memberships and social status than in the work that had built their fortune. And Amara, sweet Amara, remained the only one who still looked at Malcolm with genuine love and respect. When Malcolm's health began to decline 3 years ago, he made a decision that would change everything. The doctors said his eyesight was failing, that his hearing was deteriorating. They weren't wrong, but they weren't entirely right either. Malcolm could still see, though not as sharply as before. He could still hear, though certain frequencies escaped him. But he recognized an opportunity when he saw one. He recognized the greed in Catherine's eyes when the doctor delivered the prognosis. He noticed the way Ryan and Derek exchanged glances, the way they tried to hide their smiles. So Malcolm decided to play the role they wanted him to play. He would become the blind and deaf old man, completely dependent, completely helpless. And in doing so, he would see their true nature revealed. The transformation was gradual. He started wearing dark glasses all the time, claiming the light hurt his sensitive eyes. He got a hearing aid and would often ask people to repeat themselves, shaking his head in confusion. He walked with a cane, shuffling slowly, acting frail. Catherine took over managing the household, the finances, the social calendar. The boys began to assert themselves in business meetings, speaking for their father, making decisions they claimed were in his best interest. And through it all, Malcolm watched and listened, his heart breaking a little more each day. They moved him out of the master bedroom first. Catherine said it was for his own comfort, that the stairs were too difficult for him to navigate safely. The room they gave him was small, tucked away at the back of the mansion near the service entrance. It had a single window that looked out onto the staff parking area, a narrow bed, a small dresser, and a chair. The door had a lock on the outside. For his safety, Catherine explained to the staff, so he doesn't wander and hurt himself. But Malcolm knew the truth. The lock was to keep him contained, to keep him out of sight when they had guests, to make him easier to forget. Meals came late and cold. Malcolm would sit in his chair, pretending not to notice the hours that passed, pretending not to hear his stomach growl. When the tray finally arrived, brought by a staff member who looked at him with pity, the food would be barely warm, hastily prepared, nothing like the elaborate dinners being served in the main dining room. He could smell those dinners sometimes, the aroma drifting through the ventilation system, reminding him of what he was no longer welcome to share. He ate in silence, chewing slowly, maintaining the facade even when alone. He had installed a small camera in his room, disguised as a smoke detector, and he knew Catherine sometimes checked the footage. He couldn't afford to break character, not even for a moment. The humiliation was systematic and deliberate. When they had guests, Malcolm was forbidden from appearing in the common areas. Catherine would lock him in his room, and he would hear the sounds of laughter and conversation echoing through the halls, the clinking of glasses, the music, the life happening without him. Once, he heard a guest ask about him, and Catherine's response made his blood run cold. "Oh, Malcolm is resting," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "He can't really function in social situations anymore. It's quite sad, really. He doesn't know where he is half the time. We keep him comfortable, but honestly, he's just a shadow of the man he used to be." The guest made sympathetic sounds, and Catherine accepted their pity with practiced grace. Ryan and Derek were even worse. Malcolm heard them bring their friends to the house, young men who laughed too loudly and spoke with the casual cruelty of those who had never known struggle. One afternoon, Malcolm's door wasn't fully closed, and he heard Derek leading a group past his room. "That's where the old man lives now," Derek said, his voice filled with mockery. "Used to own half the city. Now he can't even find the bathroom. He embarrasses us. Can't let him out when people are here." The friends laughed, and Malcolm felt something inside him harden. These were the boys he had raised, the boys he had given everything to, and this was how they saw him. But it was in the living room, during a conversation Malcolm wasn't supposed to hear, that the true depth of their betrayal became clear. He had been working on a method to move through the house undetected, using the vibrations in the floor to sense when rooms were occupied, using the reflections in windows and mirrors to see around corners without being seen. He had always been brilliant with technology, and he had adapted those skills to his current situation, installing tiny microphones in key rooms, using his smartphone with accessibility features that allowed him to monitor the house remotely. On this particular evening, he had positioned himself near the living room, hidden in an alcove where the shadows were deep. Through a mirror mounted on the opposite wall, he could see them clearly. Catherine sat on the leather sofa he had bought in Milan, Ryan and Derek on either side of her, all three holding glasses of wine from Malcolm's personal collection. "We need to move faster," Catherine said, her voice sharp and businesslike. "Malcolm's trustees are starting to ask questions about the property transfers. We need to finalize the sales before anyone looks too closely at the paperwork." Ryan nodded, swirling his wine. "The downtown properties alone are worth $40 million. Once those are sold, we can move on to the commercial holdings. By the time anyone realizes what's happening, it'll be too late." Derek leaned back, a satisfied smirk on his face. "And the old man will be tucked away in some government welfare home, completely out of the picture. It's perfect. He won't even know what happened." Catherine laughed, a sound that once might have been musical but now struck Malcolm as cruel and hollow. "He doesn't know anything anymore. The doctors confirmed his mental decline is irreversible. We have full legal authority to act in his best interest. And what's in his best interest is for us to preserve the estate by liquidating these assets before they become a burden." Malcolm's hands trembled, but he kept them still, kept his breathing even. He had suspected, but hearing it confirmed, Hearing them speak so casually about dismantling everything he had built, about abandoning him to a welfare facility as if he were trash to be discarded, it took every ounce of his self-control not to reveal himself right then. If this level of betrayal makes your blood boil, you need to subscribe right now, because what happens when Malcolm reveals the truth will leave you speechless. Don't miss the moment justice finally arrives. What about Amara? Ryan asked, and there was contempt in his voice when he spoke her name. She keeps asking questions, keeps saying she wants to take care of him herself. Catherine waved a dismissive hand. Amara is adopted. She has no legal claim to anything. I've already spoken to the lawyers. When we update the will, she'll be written out completely. A small trust fund, maybe just to avoid any legal challenges, but nothing substantial. She should be grateful for what she's gotten. Derek snorted. She actually thinks she's part of this family. It's pathetic. The old man felt sorry for her, that's all. Charity case. She needs to understand her place. The venom in their words, the casual dismissal of the daughter who had shown Malcolm more love in the past 3 years than they had shown in decades. It was almost too much to bear. But Malcolm remained still, remained hidden, continued to watch and listen, because he needed to know everything. He needed to understand the full scope of their betrayal before he could act. It was Amara who gave him hope, who reminded him that goodness still existed in the world. She would visit him every day, sometimes multiple times, bringing him real food, warm and carefully prepared. She would sit with him, hold his hand, talk to him about her day even though she thought he couldn't hear her. I know you can't understand me, Dad, she would say, tears sometimes glistening in her eyes. But I want you to know I love you. I won't let them hurt you. I don't care what Catherine and the boys say. You're my father, and I'm going to take care of you. Malcolm wanted so badly to respond, to tell her he heard every word, that her loyalty meant everything to him. But he couldn't risk it, not yet. Instead, he would squeeze her hand gently, a gesture she interpreted as involuntary muscle movement, but that was, in reality, his way of telling her he understood, that he was grateful, that he loved her too. The tension in the house grew as Catherine and the boys accelerated their plans. Malcolm monitored their communications, read their emails through sophisticated software he had installed on the house network. They were forging his signature on documents, transferring properties into shell corporations they controlled, setting up offshore accounts to hide the money. They had doctors prepared to testify to his incompetence, lawyers ready to push through the conservatorship paperwork, and a welfare facility already selected, a grim place with institutional walls and minimal care, the kind of place where people went to be forgotten. Amara tried to stop them. Malcolm watched through his hidden cameras as she confronted Catherine in the study, her voice shaking but determined. You can't do this, Amara said. He's still your husband. He deserves better than to be locked away. Catherine looked up from the papers she was signing, her expression cold. This doesn't concern you, Amara. These are family matters. I am family, Amara insisted, her hands clenched at her sides. He's my father. I can take care of him. I'll move back into the house full-time. I'll hire nurses. I'll make sure he has everything he needs. Ryan, who had been standing by the window, turned with a cruel smile. You're not family, Amara. You're adopted. There's a difference. You have no say in what happens to Malcolm or his estate. You don't even care about him. Amara shot back, her voice rising. You're just after his money. You've always been after his money. Derek stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. Watch your mouth. You're here because we allow you to be here. Keep pushing and we'll throw you out. You'll get nothing. Do you understand? Nothing. Amara stood her ground, though Malcolm could see her trembling. I don't want his money. I want him to be safe and loved. Something you clearly know nothing about. Catherine stood, her movements deliberate and threatening. That's enough. This conversation is over. Malcolm will be transferred to the facility next week. The papers are already filed. If you interfere, I will have you removed from this property and barred from visiting. Don't test me, Amara. Malcolm watched his daughter's face crumble, watched her turn and walk away, her shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. And in that moment, he made his final preparations. He had gathered all the evidence he needed. He had documentation of every forged signature, every illegal transfer, every fraudulent document. He had recordings of their conversations, video evidence of their conspiracies. And he had already contacted his personal attorney, a man who had worked with him for 20 years and who was fiercely loyal, instructing him to prepare criminal complaints and to have the authorities ready to act. The day they came for him arrived on a cold Tuesday morning. Malcolm sat in his chair, wearing his dark glasses, his hearing aid visible in his ear, his cane resting against his leg. He had dressed in the simple clothes they had given him, played the part of the helpless old man to perfection. He heard the vehicles pull up outside, heard the footsteps in the hallway. Catherine entered first, followed by Ryan and Derek, and behind them, two officials from the welfare facility, a man and a woman in stark uniforms carrying clipboards and folders. "Mr. Thornton," the woman said loudly, as if volume alone could penetrate his supposed deafness. "We're here to help you. We're going to take you to a nice place where you'll be very comfortable." Malcolm didn't respond, didn't move. He sat perfectly still, his head slightly bowed, the picture of defeated old age. Catherine stood to the side, her arms crossed, a satisfied smile playing at her lips. Ryan and Derek were practically grinning, barely able to contain their excitement at seeing their plan come to fruition. "He can't hear you," Catherine said to the officials. "And he can't see you either. You'll need to guide him physically. Don't worry, he's docile. He won't resist." The male official approached Malcolm, reaching out to take his arm. "Come on, sir. Let's get you up." And that's when Malcolm moved. He stood smoothly, without the cane, without the shuffling gait he had maintained for 3 years. He reached up and removed his dark glasses, revealing eyes that were sharp and clear, and filled with an intensity that made everyone in the room take a step back. He pulled the hearing aid from his ear and dropped it on the chair. When he spoke, his voice was strong and commanding, the voice of a man who had built an empire and who was not accustomed to being ignored. "I have already called the police," Malcolm said, his gaze sweeping across Catherine, Ryan, and Derek, watching the color drain from their faces. "Every illegal deal, every forged signature, every fraudulent transfer. I know about all of it. I've known from the beginning. I've watched you betray me, plot against me, plan to abandon me like garbage. And I have documented everything." The room erupted in chaos. Catherine's mouth opened and closed, no sound emerging. Ryan stumbled backward, his face ashen. Derek looked wildly around as if searching for an escape route. The welfare officials stood frozen, their clipboards forgotten, trying to process what was happening. You can see?" Catherine finally managed to choke out. "You can hear." Malcolm smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I've seen and heard everything, Catherine. Every venomous word, every cruel laugh, every piece of my life you tried to steal. Did you really think I was so easily fooled? Did you really believe I would just sit back and let you destroy everything I built? Imagine discovering the people you trusted most are betraying you. Now imagine having the strength to expose them. Would you have the courage to do the same? Subscribe now and watch how true justice unfolds. This is the moment everything changes." The sound of sirens grew louder outside, and moments later, police officers entered the house, led by Malcolm's attorney, a distinguished man in his 60s carrying a briefcase full of evidence. "Officers," the attorney said, gesturing to Catherine, Ryan, and Derek, "these are the individuals we discussed. I have documentation of fraud, forgery, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse. Mr. Thornton has been recording their activities for the past several months." Catherine found her voice, shrill and desperate. "This is ridiculous. Malcolm is mentally incompetent. He doesn't know what he's saying. We have doctors who will testify." "You have doctors you paid off," Malcolm interrupted, his voice cutting through her protests like a blade. "I have independent medical evaluations conducted last week by physicians who have no connection to you or your schemes. I am of sound mind and body. My eyesight is slightly diminished, yes. My hearing isn't what it used to be. but I am perfectly capable of managing my own affairs and making my own decisions. And my decision is to see you all prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." The police moved forward, and Ryan made a desperate lunge for the door, but an officer caught him easily, spinning him around and cuffing his hands behind his back. Derek started to protest, his voice cracking. "Dad, please, we can explain." "Don't call me that," Malcolm said, his voice cold as ice. "You lost the right to call me that the moment you decided I was worth more to you dead or discarded than alive and present. You are not my sons. You never were." Catherine tried a different approach, her voice taking on a pleading quality that made Malcolm's stomach turn. "Malcolm, please, we can work this out. I made mistakes, yes, but we're married. We have history together. Don't throw that away over some misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" Malcolm's voice rose, the anger he had suppressed for so long finally breaking through. "You locked me in a room, Catherine. You fed me scraps. You mocked me to your friends. You sold my properties, forged my signature, and planned to dump me in a state facility to die alone and forgotten. That's not a misunderstanding. That's betrayal of the deepest kind." As the officers read Catherine her rights and led her toward the door, she turned back one last time, her face contorted with rage and desperation. "You'll regret this, Malcolm. I'll fight you in court. I'll take everything." Malcolm shook his head slowly. "You already tried to take everything. You failed. The prenuptial agreement you signed 30 years ago is ironclad. You'll get nothing. Less than nothing, actually, because you'll be paying restitution and legal fees for years." Ryan and Derek were led out next, both of them looking shell-shocked, the reality of their situation finally sinking in. The mansion fell silent as the police cars pulled away, their sirens fading into the distance. The welfare officials had quietly slipped out during the arrests, their services clearly no longer needed. Malcolm stood in the center of the living room, surrounded by the opulence that suddenly felt hollow and empty. Then he heard footsteps, quick and light, and Amara burst into the room, her eyes wide with shock and wonder. She had been in her apartment in the city, but Malcolm's attorney had called her the moment the police arrived, and she had driven like a mad woman to get back to the mansion. She stopped a few feet away from Malcolm, her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "Dad?" she whispered. "You could see? You could hear? All this time?" Malcolm opened his arms, and Amara rushed into them, sobbing against his chest. He held her tightly, feeling his own tears finally come, 3 years of suppressed emotion breaking free. "I'm so sorry I couldn't tell you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I needed to know the truth. I needed to see who would stand by me when they thought I had nothing left to give." Amara pulled back, looking up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "I would have stood by you no matter what. You're my father. You saved me when no one else wanted me. You gave me a life, a future, a family. Even if you really had been blind and deaf, even if you really couldn't take care of yourself, I would never have abandoned you." Malcolm cupped her face in his hands, looking at the daughter who had proven herself to be more family than blood could ever determine. "You are my real family, Amara. You have always been my real family, and I'm about to prove that to you and to everyone else." In the weeks that followed, Malcolm worked with his attorney to undo the damage Catherine and the boys had done. Properties were recovered, accounts were frozen and repatriated, and the shell corporations were dismantled. Catherine, Ryan, and Derek faced a mountain of criminal charges. The evidence Malcolm had gathered was overwhelming, and their high-priced lawyers could do nothing against the weight of it. They pleaded for leniency, claimed they had been influenced by stress and financial pressure, but the prosecutors were unmoved. Elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy, the charges carried significant prison time. Malcolm also made changes to his estate planning. He met with his trustees and made his intentions crystal clear. Amara was to be his sole heir, inheriting the mansion, the businesses, the properties, everything. He set up foundations in her name, charitable organizations that would continue the work he had started decades ago, helping children in foster care, supporting education initiatives, funding programs for the elderly. He wanted his legacy to be one of compassion and justice, and he knew Amara would honor that legacy in ways Catherine and the boys never could. The mansion itself underwent a transformation. Malcolm had the small room at the back torn down completely, the space converted into a library and reading room, filled with light and books and comfortable chairs. He reclaimed the master bedroom, but found he preferred one of the other suites, one with large windows that overlooked the garden where he and Amara would have breakfast together every morning. The staff, who had watched in silent horror as he was mistreated, were overjoyed to see him restored to his rightful place. Many of them had suspected the truth but had been too afraid to speak up, fearing they would lose their jobs. Malcolm assured them that their loyalty would be rewarded, and he gave bonuses to those who had shown him kindness during his time in isolation. The trial became national news. A billionaire who had pretended to be disabled to expose his family's greed. It was the kind of story that captured the public imagination. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, and every detail was dissected and analyzed. Malcolm gave one interview to a respected journalist who approached the story with the gravity it deserved. "Why did you do it?" the journalist asked, leaning forward in her chair. "Why not just confront them directly?" Malcolm considered the question carefully before answering. "Because I needed to know the truth. I needed to see what they would do when they thought I was powerless. If I had confronted them while I was still strong, still clearly in control, they would have lied. They would have put on a performance, told me what I wanted to hear. But when they thought I couldn't see or hear them, when they thought I was helpless, they revealed their true nature. And that's something I needed to know, painful as it was. Do you regret it? The pain you endured? Every day?" Malcolm admitted, his voice quiet. "It broke my heart to see the people I loved, the people I had provided for and protected, treat me with such contempt. But I don't regret learning the truth. And I don't regret standing up for myself and for the daughter who stood by me." The journalist's final question was about Amara. "What does she mean to you?" Malcolm's face softened, and for the first time in the interview, he smiled genuinely. "Amara is proof that family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by loyalty, by love, by showing up when it matters most. She could have walked away. Catherine and the boys made it clear she would gain nothing by supporting me. But she stayed anyway. That's real family. That's the kind of person I want to carry on my legacy." The trial ended with convictions on all major charges. Catherine received 8 years for fraud and conspiracy. Ryan and Derek each received 6 years for their roles in the scheme. They were also ordered to pay millions in restitution, money they didn't have and would likely never be able to repay. Malcolm attended the sentencing hearing, sitting in the front row with Amara by his side. When the judge asked if he wanted to make a statement, he stood and addressed the court. "I don't take any pleasure in seeing them imprisoned," he said, his voice carrying through the silent courtroom. "They were my family. I loved them, but they made choices, and choices have consequences. They chose greed over love. They chose cruelty over compassion. They chose to see me as an obstacle to be removed rather than a person to be cherished. And in doing so, they forfeited any claim to my affection or my forgiveness. I hope that in their time away, they will reflect on those choices and emerge as better people. But I will not be there to see it. They are no longer part of my life." As Malcolm and Amara left the courthouse, reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but they walked straight ahead. Amara's arm linked through her father's, both of them looking forward, not back. They drove to the mansion together, and when they arrived, Malcolm did something he hadn't done in years. He walked through the front door without pretense, without performance, just himself. A man who had been tested and had emerged stronger, wiser, and more certain of what truly mattered. The months that followed were healing ones. Malcolm reconnected with old friends who had fallen away during his marriage to Catherine. People who remembered him as he truly was and welcomed him back with open arms. He took a more active role in his charitable foundations, visiting schools and community centers, shaking hands with the people his money was helping, seeing firsthand the difference he was making. And he spent time with Amara, teaching her about the business, preparing her for the responsibilities she would one day inherit. But more than that, just being present, being a father in all the ways that mattered. One evening, as they sat together on the terrace watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Amara asked him a question that had been on her mind for months. Do you think you would have done it differently? If you could go back, would you have revealed yourself sooner? Malcolm thought about it, swirling the tea in his cup. I don't know, he said honestly. Part of me wishes I had never had to go through it at all, that I had married someone different, raised sons who valued more than money. But then I think about what I learned, about who revealed themselves to be true and who revealed themselves to be false. I think about you, and how your loyalty shone brightest in the darkness. No, I don't think I would change it. Sometimes we have to go through fire to know what's real and what's just beautiful ashes. Amara nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. I'm just glad you're here. Really here. So am I, sweetheart. So am I. The mansion, once a place of isolation and betrayal, became a home again. Malcolm hosted gatherings for his foundations, filled the rooms with people who were doing meaningful work in the world, people who reminded him why he had built his fortune in the first place. Not to hoard it, but to use it to make a difference. Staff members who had been afraid to smile during Catherine's reign now laughed freely, brought their children to holiday parties, felt like valued members of a community rather than invisible servants. Malcolm also made peace with his limitations. His eyesight truly wasn't what it used to be, and he found himself using reading glasses more often, larger print on his computer. His hearing sometimes failed him in crowded rooms, and he had no shame in asking people to repeat themselves. But these were natural parts of aging, not weaknesses to be exploited. And he faced them with the same courage and pragmatism he had brought to every challenge in his life. On the anniversary of the day he had revealed the truth and seen his betrayers arrested, Malcolm organized a small private ceremony. He stood in the room that had once been his prison, now transformed into a beautiful library, and he spoke to the gathered staff and close friends. I want to talk about what this past year has taught me, he began, his voice strong and clear. I learned that silence is not weakness. I learned that patience can be a weapon against those who mistake kindness for stupidity. But most importantly, I learned that true family has nothing to do with blood and everything to do with who stands beside you when the world tells them they have nothing to gain from it. He turned to Amara, who stood nearby, tears already forming in her eyes. This young woman could have walked away. She could have accepted the small trust fund they offered her and lived comfortably, never looking back. Instead, she fought for me. She stood up to people who belittled her, threatened her, told her she was nothing. She did it because she loves me, not because of what I could give her, but because of who I am. That is the definition of family. The room erupted in applause, and Amara wiped her eyes, smiling through her tears. Malcolm raised his glass in a toast. To loyalty, to love, to the families we choose and the legacies we build not in marble and stone, but in the hearts of those we touch. May we all be judged not by our wealth or our status, but by how we treat those who can do nothing for us. That is the measure of a life well lived. If this story has moved you, if you believe in the power of loyalty and the strength it takes to stand for what's right, subscribe now and join a community that celebrates real family values. Watch closely, because stories like these remind us what truly matters in life. In the years that followed, Malcolm watched with pride as Amara took on more responsibilities, growing into a leader in her own right. She was compassionate but firm, generous but wise, and she carried forward his values with a passion that sometimes took his breath away. When interviewers asked her about her father, about the famous case that had captivated the nation, she always spoke with grace and wisdom. My father taught me that your circumstances don't define you, she would say. What defines you is how you respond to those circumstances. He could have been bitter. He could have let their betrayal poison his heart. Instead, he used it to become clearer about his values and his purpose. He showed me that real strength isn't about never being knocked down. It's about getting back up and choosing love over hate, even when you have every reason to choose hate. Malcolm's story became a case study in business schools, in ethics classes, in psychology courses. Professors analyzed his strategy, debated whether his deception was justified, discussed the moral implications of his choice to hide his capabilities. But for Malcolm, it was never about strategy or tactics. It was about truth. about knowing who people really were beneath the masks they wore. He never reconciled with Catherine, Ryan, or Derek. They served their sentences, and when they were released, they found themselves unwelcome in the circles they had once moved through so confidently. Their reputations were destroyed, their assets depleted by legal fees and restitution payments. Malcolm heard about their struggles through his attorney, who occasionally updated him on their attempts to rebuild their lives. He felt no satisfaction in their suffering, but he felt no obligation to ease it either. They had made their choices, and they would live with the consequences. What Malcolm did feel was gratitude. Gratitude for the daughter who had proven that the family you choose can be stronger than the family you're born into. Gratitude for the second chance to live authentically, without pretense or performance. Gratitude for the wisdom that came from walking through the valley of betrayal and emerging on the other side with his integrity intact. As he grew older, as his hair turned completely white and the lines on his face deepened, Malcolm often reflected on the journey he had taken. From poverty to wealth, from obscurity to prominence, from betrayal to redemption. He had built an empire, yes, but his greatest achievement was simpler and more profound. He had learned the difference between what glitters and what's truly gold. And he had found, in an adopted daughter who owed him nothing and gave him everything, the kind of love that makes life worth living. The mansion still stood, a testament to his success, but it was no longer just a symbol of wealth. It was a home filled with laughter and purpose, a place where kindness was valued above all else, where people were judged by the content of their character rather than the size of their bank accounts. It was exactly what Malcolm had always wanted it to be, but it had taken him 70 years and a trial by fire to finally achieve it. Never mistake silence for weakness. Never assume blood alone makes a family. These were the truths Malcolm Thornton lived by, the principles he passed down to Amara and to anyone else who would listen. And in the end, that was the legacy he was most proud of. Not the buildings with his name on them, not the fortune in his accounts, but the simple, powerful truth that love and loyalty are the only currencies that truly matter, and the only ones that last beyond the grave. If you believe that true family is built on loyalty, not blood, and that justice always finds a way, subscribe now and be part of a community that stands for what's right. Don't miss stories that inspire, transform, and remind us of the power of choosing love over greed. Hit that subscribe button. This is only the beginning.